Good. All right, gang. Let's go ahead and get started. It is right about that time. Welcome back to Principles of Research. Here we go. This is our, fourth class period, second week. You ought to be well into stride of things, and indeed we are. So I am updating an announcement for tomorrow to reflect the updated 2025 dissertation or thesis template file. So we've been talking about this file just pretty much every class session as kind of a regular drumbeat to help everybody sort of just dip that first toe into the pool of putting together a professional research proposal if this is your first time doing that. Again, if you already have parts of your proposal written, you're welcome to transfer it into this template and turn that in a couple of times throughout the semester to keep pace with those assignments. Or if you are more comfortable with working on the file that you are already working on, maybe you're using OpenOffice or StarOffice or macOS Pages instead of Microsoft Word, that's all fine. You can use whatever tools you need to compose your thesis or dissertation proposal. You don't have to impress me by using Microsoft Word. It's just one standard software that we use. Okay, so I'll go ahead and update that link after class, and we'll have access to that. I went through this morning and updated just all the little formatting changes and added a few clarifications to the file. There's a bunch of italicized text in that template file as instructions or hints or guidelines for you. Just delete all that stuff as you go and put in your actual content. So again, we'll go through and we'll spend more time on that template file kind of all throughout the semester at each stage of the process. Right now, we're just going to be roughing in, starting today and tomorrow, just roughing in chapter and section titles, basically. So you have a very, very abstract, high-level overview of where you are going with your proposal. That is, if you can put on each fresh page, introduction, methods, and literature review in no particular order. And then the sections that go into there based on this template or based on what your thesis or dissertation proposal needs, then this first proposal writing assignment is going to be just fine. We'll get into adding lots of content to it later on, but first we just want to have a structure so we have a place to throw all of that content and it stays at least reasonably organized. Sound good? Okay, cool. So that's where we're going after class. This will head up to the course website after class. Let's pick up our discussion where we left it on Tuesday on different paradigms of knowledge creation. That is, different ways of understanding how research can work, different ways of understanding what research can fundamentally be, how they exist. We left class on Tuesday talking about the positivist or the reductionist, the empirical approach on studying something like religion. And we used a reductio ad absurdum, that is, oversimplifying until it's absurd. Thought process of study religion, and we study sociology, study of people in large masses and groups. We study that by studying the individual and extrapolating out to the larger group. But we really study biology by understand psychology by understanding the fundamental underlying neurochemistry of biology and human biological processes, and all the way down until we're just left with math. So this is an exaggeration for emphasis. but this is an important lesson for you as researchers because your advisor or your project sponsor, they're going to ask you to do a lot of this. Take things out in nature, take things in human society, and boil them down to summarize them, abstract them, so that you are doing analyses on numbers, numeric representations of reality, not on reality directly itself. This is very important because a typical reflex, and everybody goes through this phase as you are learning graduate statistics for the first time or the second, third, fourth, fifth time as a PhD student, maybe. There's a sense of, okay, this statistical test is going to give me a number, and I either pass the test or I fail the test. And most of us have been so wired, so trained, so taught, so inculcated with the idea that passing a test is good and failing a test is bad, that we can make the mistake of looking at a statistical failure in air quotes for the recording, and think, uh-oh, I have a problem, or there's something wrong, or I've done a bad job. This didn't come out positively. There is a measurable observed bias in professionally published research all across the world for finding and publishing statistically positive results. Okay? And this is positive in the sense of passing the statistical test, not positive in the sense of a number that is larger than 0. All right. So we want to acknowledge this. This mindset, this thinking rules the science world for the most part, but it is not fully correct. It is not fully accurate. It is a model. All models are abstractions of reality, and all models are wrong because they are abstractions. They are not reality. It's an approximation of the real thing. It's a simplification of the real thing. Okay? But what you are being asked to study and provide recommendations on, provide process refinements on, is reality, not the model. So you as the researcher need to be comfortable and functional stepping into this approximation process and understand that with each approximation, you get a little bit further from reality. And so when you are building your conclusions, your recommendations for future research, your recommendations for management or for technological advancement, you have to come back from those abstractions to and bridge back to reality and say, look, our model says this, but there are some important things that we need to understand in stepping from recommendations out of the model to recommendations in reality. All right? We have to keep a hold on that. Unfortunately, most of us are not working with results and we're not thinking about discussion yet. We're just trying to figure out, what am I going to do? What's my research question? And so forth. So we're going to spend a little bit of time on some other research paradigms that will help us accomplish this research. So the interpretive paradigm is very much the opposite of, or the contrapositive. They are both good, both useful, but very different in their fundamental understanding and approach versus the empirical reductionist approach that we just talked about. The interpretive paradigm is one that is explicitly looking at the subjective sense of things, things that we cannot measure with a ruler or an electronic sensor, right? So we cannot study some things in the minds of people, maybe things like faith, religion, spirituality. Those don't make sense in a psychological study context. But we can make a lot of sense of those things by understanding in an empathic way, a subjective, a unique to each study participant way, instead of just mashing everybody together and reporting an average, a numeric average. It doesn't work here. So we're talking about things like relative values, principles, ideals. This is how we study things like the human senses, plural, of free will or volition, meaning what do we will to do? Things like morality and ethics, right? We use subjective reasoning frameworks to interrogate these things. And some of these researchers have taken the posture, the sense that if you are interrogating meaningful and difficult problems of real human struggle, then maybe if you know something or learn something as a result of this research, it has to translate into meaningful social action. Beyond publishing your thesis or dissertation on impoverished people of a minority or a lower status caste, maybe in your society, if you find some real pain points that can be changed as a function of your research, as an output of your research, then maybe these researchers are onto something with the idea that you take this research and you give it back to the people that you studied. And you give it back to people that are interacting with the people that you studied, and you look to ease the pain, reduce the suffering, address the structural problem in society that your research has uncovered. This is very different than lab research. This is talking to a lot of people, reflecting very deeply on the thick data, as it's called, the qualitative data that those interviews, those conversations, those focus groups, those panel studies, those semi-structured interviews reveal to you, okay? And this is absolutely as valid as running lab experiments or running row crop field experiments. It's just a different kind of effort that leads to a very different kind of output. But along the way, you can get a thesis or dissertation doing stuff like this. There are entire programs and schools and majors that focus on this kind of work instead of watershed work or oak classification on the Shawnee, for example. Okay, cool. So there are blends of these or mixed mode research efforts that try to take things like human questionnaire and survey or test data and pair it with qualitative, open-ended, thick interview data and see how these different quantitative versus qualitative techniques can both look onto problems that we can study using both sets or mindsets of techniques or approaches. Cool. So mixed method studies are hard. They're a lot of work because you're doing stats and interviews. But because each research tool, each statistical test has its strong points and its weak points, and interviews have their strong points and their weak points, you can get at the blind spots of a quantitative method with a qualitative method. So for those of you working with humans in your research, it's very, very common to have a survey instrument with closed-ended, numerically coded questions and answers. And then in that survey instrument, have open-ended questions where the answer is not supplied for the respondent, and they just tell you whatever they think, or whatever they feel, whatever they believe as the answer to those open-ended questions. And so we see if the open-ended answers correspond to, agree with, or get at the idea underlying, the factor underlying why we wrote those quantitative survey questions. And if they agree, great. If they don't agree, now we have something really interesting. Our survey responses tell us this, and our open-ended responses tell us this, and they overlap some, but there's some not overlap. This part over here doesn't seem to agree with this part over here. Why is that? That's how we get to research and science breakthroughs. So most research projects are evolutionary. We're taking things that we already know, maybe 75% of, 90% of, something like that, and then applying it in a new place. We're applying it in a new time or both. It's an incremental step forward. In 1970, somebody did this study. In 2025, 55 years later, we're doing the same study, let's compare and contrast. That's an evolution of that 1970 study done a half century later in 2025. But when we get to places where we see things that don't quite match what we expected, those moments where we say, well, I know that's not a wrong result. I collected these data, I've analyzed them correctly. It's just not at all what I expected. So I know it's not wrong. That means something in my theory, something in my research questions, presuppositions, the things that I'm assuming are true in order to ask my research question the way that I am. Maybe something's not fully right in my assumptions or my presuppositions. And this is how we get to things like rapid quantum leaps in scientific advancement instead of small evolutionary steps. Okay. Now, for your first research effort, if you're a master's student, this is your first or second semester, you're still just sort of figuring all this stuff out, don't worry about trying to do the moonshot, the 1 in a million study that gets this quantum leap forward in your field. You're not necessarily here to advance the state of the art by a giant step. You are here to learn how to do that, right? So if your work is pretty evolutionary, if you are doing, this is very common setup for master's students in graduate school, if you are doing a research project that is a direct extra year or two extension of like a previous graduate student's research project, and it's just like, we're doing the same thing they were, we're just collecting year 3 and 4 of this field study, for example, and they've already collected year 1 and 2 in exactly the same way and analyzed it, and we're probably going to find exactly the same thing. There's nothing wrong with that. That's really, really, really important to do those, just even if it feels like a baby step forward in what we now know about your study area or your research question. That's okay. Because again, your primary job isn't to extend knowledge hugely and blow everybody's mind. Sometimes, very rarely, that does happen. But for the most part, you're here to pick up the skills to set yourself up to be able to do that across your entire career. Okay, so the expectation here isn't that you just explode everyone's cranium with new insight. It is, okay, does Harry know how to do this research project? Okay, everybody signs off on it. Harry gets a great job of doing this kind of research, and now Harry's got a lifetime, basically, to make or discover some of those quantum leaps that start with a, that wasn't the result I expected, or, that's a little weird, or, I know I set up and calibrated those field sensors correctly, but I'm not finding what I thought I did, or what's this little blip in the sensor data? What is that? Is that a nearby lightning strike? Was it an earthquake? Was it somebody who has no idea you're even running a study, walking through that field and tripping over the sensor? Well, again, we can figure that stuff out, right? Maybe it's not any of those things. Maybe it is legitimately something that is truly unexpected and is going to flip the table, overturn our expectation, our understanding of how your research phenomenon under study works. Okay, cool. So let's talk about sort of another way to classify things in terms of, I'm studying a million versions of this thing, maybe a million crops in the same field, all of the same species. And we're going to collect a bunch of statistics on those to characterize what is the difference, or what's the average, kernel biomass in this new corn strain versus a reference strain that people have been growing for the last 20 years or whatever. That's nomothetic research. It's big data approach. Let's get all of the observations that we can across as many different but related and valid for inclusion individual units of analysis. I'm going to run a lot of stats on stuff like this. Nomothetic research. Idiographic research, the Greek root idio, relates to unique. Now, these days, we use the word idiot to refer to someone of low intelligence in a very pejorative or insulting way. But the original sense of this was studying this one person, this one company, this one place, this whatever the phenomenon is, because there is only one like it. So if you want to do research in the realm of business, for example, you could hook into a bunch of data streams of maybe a technology company, somebody like Google, for example, and get billions or trillions of data points and use big data or data science approaches to analyzing that work. Increasingly, our field research in the natural sciences and the field sciences is moving this direction because with automated sensors, automated resampling, we have these continuous, more or less, or discrete interval streams of data that we just hook into a model and set it up, calibrate it, and now we can make some predictions. So we can build a climate model and then predict things like local weather out of it. The idiographic approach in the business realm might be something more along the lines of, okay, so I want to study what makes Apple a multi-trillion-dollar organization. But there's not a million apples for me to study. There's one. So I'm going to use maybe some more qualitative techniques and some quantitative techniques together to understand what makes Apple unique. Therefore, my fixing my geography of the video, the unique phenomenon or exemplar case within a phenomenon, Apple within businesses, is going to be an idiographic approach. And it might be Apple versus Microsoft versus a local software shop here in Carbondale, right? We can draw some comparisons and contrasts between those in things like work culture or business processes or their internal business research and so forth. But we're not really running a bunch of stats on those things. So idiographic versus nomothetic. Think about your area of research. Show of hands, how many of you are generally working on something that is nomothetic? I'm looking at tens, dozens, hundreds, thousands, millions of units of analysis. Plants, reaches in a stream, geographic points on the Shawnee National Forest, or quadrats or transects on the Shawnee National Forest. I'm going to have a lot of numbers, or a lot of cases, or a lot of observations, or a lot of individuals accounted for in my research. Okay, you're in the nomothetic camp, and that's all right. Is there anybody in the idiographic camp? This is typically a smaller number of people in the College of Ag Sciences, but looking at one or a few cases very, very closely, very deeply, much more deeply than a quantitative nomothetic survey could. Got a couple of people doing that. Very cool. All right. So they are both good. Explanation of a case, complete and detailed, versus nomothetic research, where we are trying to build a theory based on lots and lots and lots of parallel observations of lots and lots and lots of cases. Okay? So for those of you who raised your hand and said, I'm doing nomothetic research, the sense that the truth is out there, which was a motto or a slogan from a 1990s TV show in the United States called The X-Files. The sense is, if we can just logic and reason our way through a huge pile of data, we can understand or uncover the causal law, and we'll express that understanding as a theory. All right? So the causal law is real out there in nature somewhere. It is how gravity and light and all of the other fundamental forces of the universe actually work. And then we have a human encapsulation or explanation of that actual thing that is out there in our model, our theory of gravity and subatomic particles and superstrings and galactic superclusters and so forth. Okay? And so we build this under the nomothetic approach. And we start running a bunch of experiments to try and break that theory. And the idea is if I break a theory 10% and rebuild that 10% better because now I know how to break it, well, then we're going to get just a little bit closer, maybe a few percent closer to the real understanding that reflects that causal law in actual reality. Okay? So this is hypothesis testing. A hypothesis is nothing more than a statement, and it's null hypothesis, it's paired statement, about how the phenomenon works, and you set up an experiment, control all the other factors that you can, and set up trials, different treatments, different interventions that try to disprove or break that thesis statement, that hypothesis. Okay, cool. So we are looking to disprove, we're looking to break in some small way, maybe, everybody else's previous work. If we're just looking to use a previously figured out by somebody else theory to describe an area, to characterize soil erosion in stream reaches, to measure and express soil transport erosion in a farm field setting, well, we're not really trying to disprove a current factual model. So that's going to be one step back from nomothetic covering law modeling. Okay. Instead, this is going to be what's called descriptive research. So in a sec, we'll get into what the 3 levels or the 3 phases in a life cycle of a research effort around a phenomenon look like. Okay, so with the nomothetic model, this is what we all saw in primary school, 6th grade maybe, the scientific method. This is the deductive approach. We have some understanding about the world, but it is incomplete, so we formulate a research question. We put together hypotheses, which is your personal theory distilled down for the scope of this particular one study. We put together a methodology, and from that we get methods, and then we actually run the trial, collect data, analyze those data after preparation and cleaning and vetting those data, seeing how much we trust those observations. From that, we form our results, discuss those results, what insights we might glean or gather from them. And then we answer, hopefully, our research question, but there is always more to ask. And so the discussion is helping to pose the next study's research questions. This is not news to anybody. This is every lab experiment you've ever done, lab exercise in any of your science classes ever, or if you do citizen science, what you've done informally on your own. But this is solidly the deductive reasoning approach. So deductive as opposed to inductive. Right? We run that cycle clockwise forward. Okay? We deduce from the theory what we expect to find with our research question as it's tested by the hypothesis, and then run that cycle forward again and again. So the general theory, the covering law model, the high level, the abstract theory that applies to lots of places, lots of times, lots of contexts, leads to an operationalized sense of it. What am I going to do to define each of the constructs in this theory, each of the boxes in the flow model of the theory, specific to this particular scope of research, this time frame, this place that I am studying for my thesis or dissertation, just this one project. That's the specific theory. And then from there, your methods are the testable application of that specific theory built out of or specified, or we use the term operationalized out of general theory. Okay, so as one example, that has been germane in the United States. Following September 11th, 2001, there was a lot of news coverage about Muslim Americans. And Some of it was positive and some of it was really pretty negative. And so researchers in the social or idiographic sense of things put together the theory that we form opinions about groups of other people that we don't know very well based on what we consume out of the media. Now, this is post September 11th, 2001. So we don't have things like social media yet. Facebook is just about to exist, but it doesn't yet, right? So state-sponsored, large-scale, organized online misinformation campaigns don't really exist yet. We do have what the news writers and the news anchors think about the groups they are reporting on. And maybe or maybe not, including or baking in implicit biases or just ignorance about the folks that they are reporting on. So the researchers formulate a specific theory out of the covering long model theory, general theory, that USA television covers Muslims negatively. Again, 25 years ago, people consumed a lot more of their news via television versus online sources of today. The testable application, the hypothesis, the very specific thing that we can test is American teens view Muslims negatively based on United States television coverage of Muslims tending to move to emphasizing or focusing or only talking about negative aspects of Muslim American perceptions, right? Not that the Muslims themselves are good, bad, or even any different than anybody else. It's that how they are portrayed in the media is negative, and that steers how American teens, who generally have low contact with Muslim Americans just based on population sizes, that's how it goes, right? So you collect a bunch of data, you talk to a bunch of teens, get a bunch of information from as many teens in a as representative as possible sample, and you get as much analysis of United States television coverage. You get transcripts, typed up scripts of what the newscasters said. And then you analyze both of those things separately using semantic analysis or qualitative analysis on what was said, or quantitative linguistic analysis, running statistics on bodies of words like scripts. And we count the number of positive words or the number of negative words or the strength of those positive words, strength of the negative words. What's the ratio of positive language to negative language talking about Muslims or any other people group under study, and so forth. And so we get this sort of deductive hypothesis and then the test of this idea. Now, another way to go after this is to take a look at the scientific method and ask, what if we took this cycle and reversed it? What if we started without a theory? What if we just went in not blind, but sort of uninfluenced by previous thinking? That might be helpful in some cases where the previous thinking is old or out of date or just biased or inaccurate, flawed in some other way. There are lots of ways that the ways that we think as people can be flawed, and that's okay. It's part of the human experience and condition. But what if we took the scientific method and reversed the order? We went counterclockwise in this case. So in this case, we start with trials. We start with methods, but we start with data. We just start talking to people. We start having conversations with teens and asking them things like, so have you been watching the news at all? Oh yeah, what kind of stuff do you remember from the newscast? Or how many folks in your high school are, in your secondary school, are, sort of openly Muslim or of a Muslim faith or cultural tradition that you're aware of in your school, right? And so the inductive approach is bottom up. It's called the grassroots approach. We're starting from not a huge research apparatus, but we're starting with conversations out of semi-structured interviews. And data before we form our specific theory of how teenage, high school, or secondary school students think about Muslims. We let the research subject tell us where to go with the research and the research hypothesis. Okay? So this approach gave us what's called the contact hypothesis. And the specific theory was that, okay, if we talk to a bunch of different teens in a bunch of different schools, some of those schools are going to have a high proportion of Muslim American students, and other schools are going to have a very low proportion, maybe even 0% Muslim American students. And we think that the students who are in more and regular contact with other regular students, they're going to be more comfortable with those Muslim American students, and they're not going to see them as other than or separate or scary or dangerous because they have class with them every day and they see they're just like normal people like everybody else. And that gets extrapolated out or grown out to the general theory, which gets the name the contact hypothesis. Contact hypothesis doesn't specifically deal with different faiths. It does deal with any kind of people in more or less contact with any other kind of people, right? So we're going from the specified, the operationalized, to the general, the covering law model, not the actual covering law. We can't know that, not even statistically, especially not statistically, but we can get closer and closer and closer to it. Both of these research processes, the clockwise, the forward running of the scientific method, the deductive approach, and the counterclockwise, the running backwards of the method, starting from the ground up with data instead of a huge covering law. Those are both valid and very common applications of the approach. So if we modify that 6 or 7 phase cycle of the scientific method, it looks like this. Deduction, moving from theory through hypothesis down to observation and getting towards the empirical generalization first and last, versus induction, starting with observations and getting to hypotheses, building a specific theory, and then generalizing out to the general covering understanding. Okay? Cool. So, as a researcher, as a budding researcher, you need to be able to think in terms of both of these. And one very easy way to sort, am I going to go clockwise on the scientific method? Am I going to start with a theory and run through data and analyses and get back to theory? Or am I going to start with data and eventually I'll get to the theory, if I get to it? Right? The way that we help decide between those two, because it's hard to do both at the same time. Very hard. Very, very hard. Okay? Because if a theory has a blind spot or a misunderstanding or a human bias baked in, we cannot start with that if we're starting with data, right? It's hard to do both of these simultaneously on the same data set, if you want to think of it that way. So the way that we help choose is we identify where on this 3-stage life cycle of understanding about the topic, research question, that we are, okay? So exploratory research is just trying to figure out what is this phenomenon. I noticed this thing about American society, or I noticed this thing about fields in an agricultural context, or I noticed whatever. And I'm not real sure about what's going on because this is the first time I've noticed this, and it's the first time, according to my initial literature review or search, it's the first time anybody really thought about this thing. That's weird. It's strange. We need to explore that phenomenon first. We're just trying to get a sense of the basic what is it? Question. What am I looking at? In the past several years, there's been an absolute explosion of unidentified flying object found footage all across the world, but almost exclusively in the United States. It's weird. And we don't know what those are. Now, sometimes we can correlate the flashing light pattern and color to the underside of different models of flying vehicle fixed wing craft like airplanes or rotary wing craft like helicopters or autogyros. We can identify some of them. And maybe let's just say that aliens are out there. There are non-human machines and non-human life present in our skies, and we can observe them through cameras cybernetically or through our eyes, both empirically. We don't have a real good sense as a society of what those non-human machines or people are. So super basic what questions? What am I looking at? What is this? What is this blip in my data? Everything else is well explained, and this one thing, it's not electrical interference, it's not somebody tripping over the sensor, it might be something new. Maybe we found something that nobody has ever found before. We just got lucky. Exploratory research is very much in this space. Descriptive research, now we're starting to get to attributes of the phenomenon. So if the phenomenon is conceptually a big whatever it is, let's say it's a physical object, and we see this physical object for the first time ever in very, very grainy, high resolution, deep water sonography. So sonar pings, for example, get a super grainy image or low frame rate video. Data quality is not real good. You just maybe get sort of a blob on the screen, okay, especially from a longer distance. So then we get James Cameron to fund $1 billion research vessel and see submersible, remote operated, or with pressure hull, send people down there, and we get much closer video documentation of it, much closer in, higher resolution, higher frequency sonography. And you start to see that this sort of big, fuzzy, blobby shape has a more nuanced shape to it. And what's more, since the last time we saw it, it's moved. And it has changed orientation or face or direction that it is pointed in. Descriptive research is figuring out, is this an organism? Is it non-biological? Is it shipwrecked at the bottom of the ocean instead of some new species of whale or squid? Or is this a geothermal node that is just happens to be fish-shaped, right? Show of hands, how many of you guys and gals have ever seen the old archival NASA or otherwise photos, images of the Martian surface, what looks like a human face in it? Okay. So the first time we get that image, everybody goes, what is it? That looks a lot like a face. As it turns out, our minds, our brains, are very, very, very quick to jump to attribution of something as having a face, an effect called pareidolia. So if you've ever seen a face in the shape of the front of a Jeep, with its big googly eyes and grill that looks like a smiling mouth, that is that effect. And the same thing applies, because it's the same brains looking at other images, like of rock formations on Mars. So we get additional information at higher resolution, maybe of many more kinds of information or data, versus just an initial blurry sense of the thing existing in the first place. That's descriptive research. If you're doing field research for your master's degree or your PhD, where you are trying to control as many experimental factors as you can, but it is field research, and you cannot control certain things like weather, or you cannot control, in my field, certain things like who walks through the front gate or drives through the front gate of that national park that day, while we are running different trials, different signage or different trail designs or different messaging applications to visitors of the national park. That is a quasi-experimental design, and some researchers will call that not experimental, but descriptive. That's okay. We need every step of this life cycle to understand the phenomenon. Okay? Once we get past figuring out, okay, it's shaped like a whale, and it has moved, and it's about the size of, or it's within the size range of other whales, from the narwhal, beluga, to the blue whale, somewhere in between those sizes. We think this might be another kind of whale based on how fast it moved and a more descriptive picture of its shape or firsthand observation or video evidence and so forth. Finally, we can get into explanatory research, which is that's our hypothesis formation testing, break the hypothesis, disprove the hypothesis, revise our, up to this point, just descriptive view. Okay? So we trap the thing, or we dredge up the thing from the bottom of the ocean, and then we vivisect it, or we do a necropsy. And in this way, we can explain, how is this thing a whale? Okay, it shares 99.5% of its genome with other whale species. So phylogenetically, we're going to call this a whale. Now we can say on a genetic basis why this phenomenon is a whale instead of just, it looks kind of vaguely whale-shaped, so descriptive. So anytime you are doing a fully controlled experiment, that is definitely in the explanatory research phase. You are applying different treatments or different levels or intensities or schedules of treatments to the phenomenon to see how those treatments, interventions, stimuli, changes affect that phenomenon, so that you can say, okay, well, we tried 5 different medications on this tissue sample, and 3 of them worked. Those 3 are chemically grouped together like this, and these other 2 didn't work. They're chemically grouped over here. So let's do further research in a controlled experiment system on this pathology, this disease, this harm that has come to this tissue. And we've proved what drugs don't work. It seems like these drugs do, but we're going to need to do a lot more testing in lots of different animal and human models to figure out, is this drug doing what we think it does in the way that we think it does, and causing as few side effects or unwanted effects as possible? We're going to have to test a bunch of different doses, a bunch of different dosing schedules, a bunch of different subjects or other organisms to which this molecule is applied to see how it works in different physiologies, right? Without doing all those additional controlled experiments, we are left with what, for example, the Western health system is to, where a lot of drug research, medication research, is heavily calibrated to males and Caucasians in the United States. And so if you're a woman or a person of color in the United States, the drug dosage that you are being given wasn't necessarily developed with your physiology in mind at all. Hopefully, they did a good job and included, an equal or representative number of women across various different groups in that test. But medical tests are very expensive. They're slow. They cost billions of dollars per trial. So this is an opportunity for us to do better in that particular kind of research, right? We have to test in more and more different kinds of cases or different arrangements of experimental setups. Okay, so here's where we've got so far, and we'll close on the next slide here. We've talked about a couple of varying research paradigms. We've sort of bracketed the range of research paradigms from Idiographic to Nomothetic. from inductive to deductive, from exploratory, descriptive, and explanatory, right? Your research falls somewhere on each of those ranges. So it's helpful for you to know where your research falls on each one of these ranges so that you don't have to worry about all the rest of those ranges. Like if you're just doing a statistical study on a field, you have to think about generating a theory about how that field is working. Somebody has gone before, and you can lean into that. Okay? You're doing a deductive study in that example versus an inductive one, and you don't have to try and cobble together or justify or say yes to a whole bunch of additional work to have it run in any inductive way as well. Where we're going next is very practical. So now that we know the general landscape of your research and what is around your research, but not your research, we're going to go right to the heart and soul of your proposal. How do I write my research questions? Usually plural, not always. Okay? So, come on back to class on Tuesday. I'll go ahead and post our class recordings and so forth. As soon as I can get those transcoded and uploaded to our course website, keep an eye out for that dissertation or thesis proposal template and the links to the graduate school's files, which I've also included in that announcement. Around for questions if you have them. Otherwise, great weekend. Stay warm. If you have any questions or concerns, chat with me after class, confidentially, and let's get those addressed so you can have a great semester. Thanks, guys. See you next time.